The American Mafia, commonly referred to in North America as the Italian-American Mafia, the Mafia, or the Mob, is a highly organized Italian-American criminal society and organized crime group. In North America, the organization is often colloquially referred to as the Italian Mafia or Italian Mob, though these terms may also apply to the separate yet related Sicilian Mafia or other organized crime groups in Italy or ethnic Italian crime groups in other countries. The organization is often referred to by its members as Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours, LCN. The organization's name is derived from the original mafia. The mafia in the United States emerged in impoverished Italian immigrant neighborhoods in New York's East Harlem, or Italian Harlem, the Lower East Side, and Brooklyn, also emerging in other areas of the northeastern United States and several other major metropolitan areas, such as Chicago and New Orleans, during the late 19th century and early 20th century, following waves of Italian immigration, especially from Sicily and other regions of southern Italy. Campanian, Calabrian, and other Italian criminal groups in the United States, as well as independent Italian-American criminals, eventually merged with Sicilian mafiosi to create the modern pan-Italian mafia in North America. Today, the Italian-American Mafia cooperates in various criminal activities with Italian organized crime groups, such as the Sicilian Mafia, the Camorra of Campania, and the 'Ndrangheta of Calabria. The most important unit of the American Mafia is that of a family, as the various criminal organizations that make up the Mafia are known. Despite the name of family to describe the various units, they are not familial groupings. The Mafia is most active in the northeastern United States, with the heaviest activity in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, and New England, in areas such as Boston, Providence, and Hartford. It also remains heavily active in Chicago and has a significant and powerful presence in other Midwestern metropolitan areas such as Kansas City, Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and St. Louis. Outside of these areas, the Mafia is also very active in Florida, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. Mafia families have previously existed to a greater extent and continue to exist to a lesser extent in northeastern Pennsylvania, Dallas, Denver, New Orleans, Rochester, San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, and Tampa. While some of the regional crime families in these areas may no longer exist to the same extent as before, descendants have continued to engage in criminal operations, while consolidation has occurred in other areas, with rackets being controlled by more powerful crime families from nearby cities. At the Mafia's peak, there were at least 26 cities around the United States with Cosa Nostra families, with many more offshoots and associates in other cities. There are 5 main New York City Mafia families, known as the Five Families: the Gambino, Lucchese, Genovese, Bonanno, and Colombo families. The Italian-American Mafia has long dominated organized crime in the United States. Each crime family has its own territory and operates independently, while nationwide coordination is overseen by the Commission, which consists of the bosses of each of the strongest families. Though the majority of the Mafia's activities are contained to the northeastern United States and Chicago, they continue to dominate organized crime in the United States, despite the increasing numbers of other crime groups. The first published account of what became the Mafia in the United States dates to the spring of 1869. The New Orleans Times reported that the city's 2nd district had become overrun by well-known and notorious Sicilian murderers, counterfeiters, and burglars, who, in the last month, have formed a sort of general co-partnership or stock company for the plunder and disturbance of the city. Emigration from southern Italy to the Americas was primarily to Brazil and Argentina, and New Orleans had a heavy volume of port traffic to and from both locales. Mafia groups in the United States first became influential in the New York metropolitan area, gradually progressing from small neighborhood operations in poor Italian ghettos to citywide and eventually national organizations. The Black Hand, was a name given to an extortion method used in Italian neighborhoods at the turn of the 20th century. It has been sometimes mistaken for the Mafia itself, which it is not. The Black Hand was a criminal society, but there were many small Black Hand gangs. Black Hand extortion was often, wrongly, viewed as the activity of a single organization because Black Hand criminals in Italian communities throughout the United States used the same methods of extortion. Giuseppe Esposito was the first known Mafia member to emigrate to the United States. He and 6 other Sicilians fled to New York after murdering 11 wealthy landowners, the chancellor and a vice-chancellor of a Sicilian province. He was arrested in New Orleans in 1881 and extradited to Italy. From the 1890s to 1920 in New York City, the 5 Points Gang, founded by Paul Kelly, were very powerful in the Little Italy of the Lower East Side. Kelly recruited some street hoodlums who later became some of the most famous crime bosses of the century, such as Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and Frankie Yale. They were often in conflict with the Jewish Eastmans of the same area. There was also an influential Mafia family in East Harlem. The Neapolitan Camorra was very active in Brooklyn. In Chicago, the 19th Ward was an Italian neighborhood that became known as the Bloody 19th due to the frequent violence in the ward, mostly as a result of Mafia activity, feuds, and vendettas. New Orleans was possibly the site of the first Mafia incident in the United States that received both national and international attention. On October 15, 1890, New Orleans Police Superintendent David Hennessy was murdered execution style. It is still unclear whether Italian immigrants actually killed him, or whether it was a frame-up by nativists against the reviled underclass immigrants. Hundreds of Sicilians were arrested on mostly baseless charges, and 19 were eventually indicted for the murder. An acquittal followed, with rumors of bribed and intimidated witnesses. On March 14, 1891, after the acquittal, the outraged citizens of New Orleans organized a lynch mob and proceeded to kill 11 of the 19 defendants. 2 were hanged, 9 were shot, and the remaining 8 escaped. On January 16, 1919, Prohibition began in the United States with the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, making it illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell alcohol. Despite these bans, there was still a very high demand for it from the public. This created an atmosphere that tolerated crime as a means to provide liquor to the public, even among the police and city politicians. While not explicitly related to Mafia involvement, the murder rate during the Prohibition era rose over 40%, from 6.8 per 100,000 individuals to 9.7, and within the first 3 months succeeding the 18th Amendment, $500,000 in bonded whiskey was stolen from government warehouses. The profits that could be made from selling and distributing alcohol were worth the risk of punishment from the government, which had a difficult time enforcing prohibition. There were over 900,000 cases of liquor shipped to the borders of U.S. cities. Criminal gangs and politicians saw the opportunity to make fortunes and began shipping larger quantities of alcohol to the United States. The majority of the alcohol was imported from Canada, the Caribbean, and the American Midwest, where stills manufactured illegal alcohol. In the early 1920s, fascist Benito Mussolini took control of Italy, and waves of Italian immigrants fled to the United States. Sicilian Mafia members also fled to the United States as Mussolini cracked down on Mafia activities in Italy. Most Italian immigrants resided in tenement buildings. As a way to escape the poor lifestyle, some Italian immigrants chose to join the American Mafia. The Mafia took advantage of prohibition and began selling illegal alcohol. The profits from bootlegging far exceeded the traditional crimes of protection, extortion, gambling, and prostitution. Prohibition allowed Mafia families to make fortunes. As Prohibition continued, victorious factions went on to dominate organized crime in their respective cities, setting up the family structure of each city. The bootlegging industry organized members of these gangs before they were distinguished as today's known families. The new industry required members at all different employment levels, such as bosses, lawyers, truckers, and even members to eliminate competitors through threat force. Gangs hijacked each other's alcohol shipments, forcing rivals to pay them for protection to leave their operations alone, and armed guards almost invariably accompanied the caravans that delivered the liquor. In the 1920s, Italian mafia families began waging wars for absolute control over lucrative bootlegging rackets. As the violence erupted, Italians fought Irish and Jewish ethnic gangs for control of bootlegging in their respective territories. In New York City, Frankie Yale waged war with the Irish-American White Hand Gang. In Chicago, Al Capone and his family massacred the North Side Gang, another Irish-American outfit. In New York City, by the end of the 1920s, two factions of organized crime had emerged to fight for control of the criminal underworld, one led by Joe Masseria and the other by Salvatore Maranzano. This caused the Castellamarese War, which led to Masseria's murder in 1931. Maranzano then divided New York City into 5 families. Maranzano, the first leader of the American Mafia, established the code of conduct for the organization, set up the family divisions and structure, and established procedures for resolving disputes. In an unprecedented move, Maranzano set himself up as boss of all bosses and required all families to pay tribute to him. This new role was received negatively, and Maranzano was murdered within 6 months on the orders of Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano was a former Masseria underling who had switched sides to Maranzano and orchestrated the killing of Masseria. As an alternative to the previous despotic mafia practice of naming a single mafia boss as capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses, Luciano created the Commission in 1931, where the bosses of the most powerful families would have equal say and vote on important matters and solve disputes between families. This group ruled over the national crime syndicate and brought in an era of peace and prosperity for the American Mafia. By mid-century, there were 26 official commission-sanctioned mafia crime families, each based in a different city, except for the 5 families which were all based in New York. Each family operated independently from the others and generally had exclusive territory it controlled. As opposed to the older generation of mustache Petes such as Maranzano and Masseria, who usually worked only with fellow Italians, the Young Turks led by Luciano were more open to working with other groups, most notably the Jewish American criminal syndicates, to achieve greater profits. The Mafia thrived by following a strict set of rules that originated in Sicily that called for an organized hierarchical structure and a code of silence that forbade its members from cooperating with the police omertà. Failure to follow any of these rules was punishable by death. The rise of power that the Mafia acquired during Prohibition would continue long after alcohol was made legal again. Criminal empires which had expanded on bootleg money would find other avenues to continue making large sums of money. When alcohol ceased to be prohibited in 1933, the Mafia diversified its money-making criminal activities to include both old and new, illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, extortion, protection rackets, drug trafficking, fencing, and labor racketeering through control of labor unions. In the mid-20th century, the Mafia was reputed to have infiltrated many labor unions in the United States, most notably the Teamsters and International Longshoremen's Association. This allowed crime families to make inroads into very profitable legitimate businesses, such as construction, demolition, waste management, trucking, and in the waterfront and garment industry. In addition, they could raid the union's health and pension funds, extort businesses with threats of a workers' strike, and participate in bid rigging. In New York City, most construction projects could not be performed without the 5 families' approval. In the port and loading dock industries, The Mafia bribed union members to tip them off to valuable items being brought in. Mobsters would then steal these products and fence the stolen merchandise. Meyer Lansky made inroads into the casino industry in Cuba during the 1930s, while the Mafia was already involved in exporting Cuban sugar and rum. When his friend Fulgencio Batista became president of Cuba in 1952, several Mafia bosses were able to make legitimate investments in legalized casinos. One estimate of the number of casinos mobsters owned was no less than 19. However, when Batista was overthrown following the Cuban Revolution, his successor Fidel Castro banned U.S. investment in the country, putting an end to the Mafia's presence in Cuba. Las Vegas was seen as an open city where any family can work. Once Nevada legalized gambling, mobsters were quick to take advantage, and the casino industry became very popular in Las Vegas. Since the 1940s, Mafia families from New York, Cleveland, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Chicago had interests in Las Vegas casinos. They got loans from the Teamsters Pension Fund, a union they effectively controlled, and used legitimate frontmen to build casinos. When money came into the counting room, hired men skimmed cash before it was recorded, then delivered it to their respective bosses. This money went unrecorded, but the amount is estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Operating in the shadows, the Mafia faced little opposition from law enforcement. Local law enforcement agencies did not have the resources or knowledge to effectively combat organized crime committed by a secret society they were unaware existed. Many people within police forces and courts were simply bribed, while witness intimidation was also common. In 1951, a United States Senate committee called the Kefauver hearings determined that a sinister criminal organization known as the Mafia operated in the nation. Many suspected mobsters were subpoenaed for questioning, but few testified and none gave any meaningful information. In 1957, New York State Police uncovered a meeting and arrested major figures from around the country in Appalachian, New York. The event, dubbed the Appalachian Meeting, forced the FBI to recognize organized crime as a serious problem in the United States and changed the way law enforcement investigated it. In 1963, Joe Valachi became the first Mafia member to turn state's evidence and provided detailed information of its inner workings and secrets. More importantly, he revealed the Mafia's existence to the law, which enabled the Federal Bureau of Investigation to begin an aggressive assault on the Mafia's national crime syndicate. Following Valachi's testimony, the Mafia could no longer operate completely in the shadows. The FBI put a lot more effort and resources into organized crime activities nationwide and created the Organized Crime Strike Force in various cities. While all this created more pressure on the Mafia, it did little, however, to curb its criminal activities. Progress was made by the beginning of the 1980s, when the FBI was able to rid Las Vegas casinos of Mafia control and made a determined effort to loosen the Mafia's stronghold on labor unions. By the late 1970s, the Mafia were involved in many industries, including betting on college sports. Several Mafia members associated with the Lucchese crime family participated in a point-shaving scandal involving the Boston College basketball team. Rick Kuhn, Henry Hill, and others associated with crime family manipulated the results of the games during the 1978 through 1979 basketball season. Through bribing and intimidating several members of the team, they ensured their bets on the point spread of each game would go in their favor. One of the most lucrative gains for the Mafia was through gas tax fraud. They created schemes to keep the money that they owed in taxes after the sale of millions of dollars worth of wholesale petroleum. This allowed them to sell more gasoline at even lower prices. Michael Franzese, also known as the Yuppie Don, ran and organized a gas scandal and stole over $290 million in gasoline taxes by evading the Internal Revenue Service and shutting down the gas station before government officials could make him pay what he owed. Franzese was caught in 1985 Labor racketeering helped the mafia control many industries from a macroeconomic scale. This tactic helped them grow in power and influence in many cities with big labor unions such as New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, and many others. Many members of the mafia were enlisted in unions and even became union executives. The mafia has controlled unions all over the United States to extort money and resources out of big business, with recent indictments of corruption involving the New Jersey Waterfront Union, the Concrete Workers Union, and the Teamster Union. Restaurants were yet another powerful means by which the mafia could gain economic power. A large concentration of mafia-owned restaurants was in New York City. Not only were they the setting of many killings and important meetings, but they were also an effective means of smuggling drugs and other illegal goods. From 1985 to 1987, Sicilian mafiosi in the U.S. imported an estimated $1.65 billion worth of heroin through pizzerias, hiding the cargo in various food products. Another one of the areas of the economy that the mafia was most influential was Las Vegas, Nevada, beginning just after World War II with the opening of the first gambling resort, the Flamingo. Many credit the mafia with being a big part of the city's development in the mid-20th century, as millions of dollars in capital flowing into new casino resorts laid the foundation for further economic growth. This capital did not come from one mafia family alone, but many throughout the country seeking to gain even more power and wealth. Large profits from casinos, run as legitimate businesses, would help to finance many of the illegal activities of the mafia from the 1950s into the 1980s. In the 1950s, more mafia-financed casinos were constructed, such as the Stardust, Sahara, Tropicana, Desert Inn, and Riviera. Tourism in the city greatly increased through the 1960s and strengthened the local economy. The 1960s were also when the mafia's influence in the Las Vegas economy began to dwindle, however. The Nevada state government and federal government had been working to weaken mafia activity on the Strip. In 1969, the Nevada state legislature passed a law that made it easier for corporations to own casinos. This brought new investors to the local economy to buy casinos from the mafia. The U.S. Congress passed the RICO Act a year later. This law gave more authority to law enforcement to pursue the mafia for its illegal activities. There was a sharp decline in mob involvement in Las Vegas in the 1980s. Through the RICO law, many in the mafia were convicted and imprisoned. When the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as the RICO Act, became federal law in 1970, it became a highly effective tool in prosecuting mobsters. It provides for extended criminal penalties for acts performed as part of an ongoing criminal organization. Violation of the act is punishable by up to 20 years in prison per count, up to $25,000 in fines, and the violator must forfeit all properties attained while violating the RICO Act. The RICO Act has proven to be a very powerful weapon because it attacks the entire corrupt entity instead of individuals who can easily be replaced with other organized crime members. Between 1981 and 1992, 23 bosses from around the country were convicted under the law, while between 1981 and 1988, 13 underbosses and 43 captains were convicted. Over 1,000 crime family figures were convicted by 1990. While this significantly crippled many mafia families around the country, the most powerful families continued to dominate crime in their territories, even if the new laws put more mobsters in jail and made it harder to operate. A high-profile RICO case sentenced John Gotti and Frank Locascio to life in prison in 1992 with the help of informant Sammy Gravano in exchange for immunity from prosecution for his crimes. Aside from avoiding long prison stretches, the FBI could put mobsters in the United States Federal Witness Protection Program, changing their identities and supporting them financially for life. This led to dozens of mobsters testifying and providing information during the 1990s, which led to the imprisonment of hundreds of other members. As a result, the Mafia has seen a major decline in its power and influence in organized crime since the 1990s. On January 9, 2003, Bonanno crime family boss Joseph Massino was arrested and indicted, alongside Salvatore Vitale, Frank Lino, and Captain Daniel Mongelli, in a comprehensive racketeering indictment. The charges against Massino himself included ordering the 1981 murder of Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano. Joe Massino's trial began on May 24, 2004, with Judge Nicholas Garofis presiding and Greg D. Andrus and Robert Hennock heading the prosecution. He now faced 11 RICO counts for 7 murders due to the prospect of prosecutors seeking the death penalty for the Ciascia murder. That case was severed to be tried separately: arson, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and money laundering. After deliberating for 5 days, the jury found Massino guilty of all 11 counts on July 30, 2004. His sentencing was initially scheduled for October 12th, and he was expected to receive a sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The jury also approved the prosecutor's recommended $10 million forfeiture of the proceeds of his reign as Bonanno boss on the day of the verdict. Immediately after his July 30th conviction, as court was adjourned, Massino requested a meeting with Judge Garofis, where he made his first offer to cooperate. He did so in hopes of sparing his life. He was facing the death penalty if found guilty of Ciascia's murder, as one of John Ashcroft's final acts as Attorney General was to order federal prosecutors to seek the death penalty for Massino. Massino thus stood to be the first mafia boss to be executed for his crimes, and the first mob boss to face the death penalty since Lepke Buchalter was executed in 1944. Massino was the first sitting boss of a New York crime family to turn state's evidence, and the second in the history of the American Mafia to do so. Philadelphia crime family boss Ralph Natal had flipped in 1999 when facing drug charges, though Natale was mostly a front boss, while the real boss of the Philadelphia Mafia used Natale as a diversion for authorities. In the 21st century, the Mafia has continued to be involved in a broad spectrum of illegal activities. These include murder, extortion, corruption of public officials, gambling, infiltration of legitimate businesses, labor racketeering, loan sharking, tax fraud schemes, and stock manipulation schemes. Although the Mafia used to be nationwide, today most of its activities are confined to the Northeast and Chicago. While other criminal organizations such as the Russian Mafia, Chinese triads, Mexican drug cartels, and others have all grabbed a share of criminal activities, the Mafia continues to be the dominant criminal organization in these regions, partly due to its strict hierarchical structure. Law enforcement is concerned with the possible resurgence of the Mafia as it regroups from the turmoil of the 1990s, although FBI and local law enforcement agencies now focus more on homeland security and less on organized crime since the September 11 attacks. To avoid FBI attention and prosecution, the modern Mafia also outsources much of its work to other criminal groups, such as motorcycle gangs. The American Mafia operates on a strict hierarchical structure. While similar to its Sicilian origins, the American Mafia's modern organizational structure was created by Salvatore Maranzano in 1931. He created the 5 families, each of which would have a boss, an underboss, captains, and soldiers, all only of full-blooded Italian origin, while associates could come from any background. All inducted members of the Mafia are called made men. This signifies that they are untouchable in the criminal underworld, and any harm brought to them will be met with retaliation. With the exception of associates, all mobsters within the Mafia are made official members of a crime family. The 3 highest positions make up the administration. Below the administration, there are factions each headed by a captain who leads a crew of soldiers and associates. They report to the administration and can be seen as equivalent to managers in a business. When a boss makes a decision, he rarely issues orders directly to workers who would carry it out, but instead passes instructions down through the chain of command. This way, the higher levels of the organization are insulated from law enforcement attention if the lower level members who actually commit the crime should be captured or investigated, providing plausible deniability. There are occasionally other positions in the family leadership. Frequently, ruling panels have been set up when a boss goes to jail to divide the responsibility of the family. These usually consist of 3 or 5 members. This also helps divert police attention from any one member. The family messenger and street boss were positions created by former Genovese family leader Vincent Giganti. The boss is the head of the family, usually reigning as a dictator, sometimes called the Don or Godfather. The boss receives a cut of every operation. Operations are taken on by every member of the family and of the region's occupying family. Depending on the family, the boss may be chosen by a vote from the cap regimes of the family. In the event of a tie, the underboss must vote. In the past, all the members of a family voted on the boss, but by the late 1950s, any gathering such as that usually attracted too much attention. In practice, many of these elections are seen as having an inevitable result, such as that of John Gotti in 1986. According to Sammy Gravano, a meeting was held in a basement during which all capos were searched, and Gotti's men stood ominously behind them. Gotti was then proclaimed boss. Underboss, the underboss, usually appointed by the boss, is the second in command of the family. The underboss often runs the day-to-day responsibilities of the family or oversees its most lucrative rackets. He usually gets a percentage of the family's income from the boss's cut. The underboss is usually first in line to become acting boss if the boss is imprisoned, and is also frequently seen as a logical successor. The consigliere counselor is an advisor to the family and sometimes seen as the boss's right-hand man. He is used as a mediator of disputes and often acts as a representative or aide for the family in meetings with other families, rival criminal organizations, and important business associates. In practice, the consigliere is normally the third-ranking member of the administration of a family and was traditionally a senior member carrying the utmost respect of the family and deeply familiar with the inner workings of the organization. A boss will often appoint a trusted close friend or personal advisor as his official consigliere. A capo regime, also called a captain or skipper, is in charge of a crew, a group of soldiers who report directly to him. Each crew usually contains 10-20 soldiers and many more associates. A capo is appointed by the boss and reports to him or the underboss. A captain gives a percentage of his and his underlings' earnings to the boss, and is also responsible for any tasks assigned, including murder. In labor racketeering, it is usually a capo who controls the infiltration of union locals. If a capo becomes powerful enough, he can sometimes wield more power than some of his superiors. In cases like that of Anthony Corallo, they might even bypass the normal mafia structure and lead the family when the boss dies. Soldier, soldato in Italian. A soldato or soldier is an inducted or made member of the mafia in general and an inducted member of a particular mafia crime family, and traditionally they can only be of full Italian background, although today many families require men to be of only half Italian descent on their father's side. Once a member is made, he is untouchable, meaning permission from a soldier's boss must be given before he is murdered. When the books are open, meaning that a family is accepting new members, a made man may recommend an up-and-coming associate to be a new soldier. Soldiers are the main workers of the family, usually committing crimes like assault, murder, extortion, intimidation, etc. In return, they are given profitable rackets to run by their superiors and have full access to their family's connections and power. An associate is not a member of the mafia, but works for a crime family nonetheless. Associates can include a wide range of people who work for the family. An associate can have a wide range of duties, from virtually carrying out the same duties as a soldier to being a simple errand boy. This is where prospective mobsters, connected guys, start out to prove their worth. Once a crime family is accepting new members, the best associates of Italian descent are evaluated and picked to become soldiers. An associate can also be a criminal who serves as a go-between in criminal transactions, or sometimes deals in drugs to keep police attention off the actual members, or they can simply be people the family does business with, restaurant owners, etc. In other cases, an associate might be a corrupt labor union delegate or businessman. Non-Italians will never go any further than this, although many non-Italian associates of the Mafia, such as Meyer Lansky, Murray Humphreys, Gus Alex, Gerard Ouimet, and Jimmy Burke, wielded extreme power within their respective crime families and carried the respect of actual Mafia members. The Mafia initiation ritual to become a made man in the Mafia emerged from various sources, such as Roman Catholic confraternities and Masonic lodges in mid-19th century Sicily. At the initiation ceremony, the inductee would have his finger pricked with a needle by the officiating member. A few drops of blood are spilled on a card bearing the likeness of a saint. The card is set on fire. Finally, while the card is passed rapidly from hand to hand to avoid burns, the novice takes an oath of loyalty to the Mafia family. The oath of loyalty to the Mafia family is called the Omerta. This was confirmed in 1986 by the Pentito Tommaso Buscetta. A hit or murder of a made man must be approved by the leadership of his family, or retaliatory hits would be made, possibly inciting a war. In a state of war, families would go to the mattresses, which means to prepare for a war or be prepared in a warlike stance. It was mainly derived from the film The Godfather, as the origin of the phrase is unknown. Omerta is a key oath or code of silence in the Mafia that places importance on silence in the face of questioning by authorities or outsiders, non-cooperation with authorities, the government, or outsiders. Traditionally, to become a made man or full member of the Mafia, the inductee was required to be a male of full Sicilian descent, later extended to males of full Italian descent, and later further extended to males of half-Italian descent through their father's lineage. According to Salvatore Vitale, it was decided during a commission meeting in 2000 to restore the rule requiring both parents to be of Italian descent. It is also common for a Mafia member to have a mistress. Traditionally, made members were also not allowed to have mustaches, part of the mustache Pete custom. Homosexuality is reportedly incompatible with the American Mafia Code of Conduct. In 1992, John D'Amato, acting boss of the DiCavalcante family, was killed when he was suspected of engaging in homosexual activity.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Max Hoff was born in Little Italy, Philadelphia, in 1892 to poor Russian Jewish immigrants. After quitting school, he worked for many years in a cigar store where the service also included gambling. His pay was raised from $12 a week to $15 after his boss noticed how his amiable personality appealed to customers. In 1917, he started a gambling operation in the section of Philadelphia now known as Society Hill. In the late 1920s, Hoff had the largest stable of prize fighters in the nation, and he staged boxing matches for many years at several Philadelphia sites. None of his boxers won a world championship, but several were highly ranked contenders in a period when boxing was a widely popular form of sports entertainment. In 1928, his stable of boxers became Max Hoff Inc. His group was the first group of prize fighters to be incorporated. In 1927, Hoff filed a $350,000 lawsuit against Gene Tunney and his manager, Billy Gibson. The suit was based on a disputed agreement, which Hoff claimed was signed by Tunney and Gibson the day before Tunney's first fight with the heavyweight champion, Jack Dempsey, in 1926. He said he loaned Tunney and Gibson $20,000 as an advance to bind an oral agreement. Tunney and Gibson claimed they needed money right away because they owed thousands of dollars to Tex Rickard, who promoted the fight and had loaned them money to cover training and other expenses. The deal called for Hoff to receive 20% of Tunney's championship fight earnings and to be joint manager with Gibson in exchange for the loan. For unknown reasons, Hoff dropped the suit in 1931, despite his insistence that he had a strong case. When Prohibition took effect in 1919, Hoff expanded his business into bootlegging, just like most mobsters in Philadelphia, including Mickey Duffy, Leo and Ignatius Lanzetta, and Salvatore Sabella. Hoff's bootlegging operation included an office with 175 phones and a weekly payroll of $30,000. Illegal booze manufacturing and distribution operations were netting Hoff's syndicate an estimated $5 million yearly by the late 1920s. Hoff became one of the richest gangsters in the United States. He hosted luxurious parties where stars of the sports and entertainment worlds partied with his accomplices. In 1929, Hoff attended the Atlantic City Conference, which was hosted by corrupt Atlantic County Treasurer Enoch Nucky Johnson and headed by Charles Lucky Luciano and Johnny Torrio. The meeting took place at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel after new Jewish mob boss Meyer Lansky's wedding in Atlantic City, New Jersey. At the conference, the two men discussed the future of organized crime and the future structure of the Mafia crime families. Other attendees included Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the Bugs and Meyer mob, Frank Costello, a member of the Masseria crime family, Abe Bernstein, the Purple Gang, Alphonse Scarface Capone, boss of Chicago's South Side Gang, Abner Zwillman, Newark crime boss, and Dutch Schultz, New York and Newark numbers racket. Hoff was called to the stand 8 times during a grand jury investigation along with 748 other witnesses who testified. Even though he denied to being a part of the bootlegging empires in Philadelphia, Philadelphia District Attorney John Monaghan nicknamed him the King of Philadelphia's bootleggers. Despite the great amount of evidence stacked against him, Hoff was never indicted during the trials because, according to a New York Times reporter, Hoff had scrupulously avoided signing any documents connected to the undercover operations. A few details that were revealed during the investigation. Hoff and his accomplices set up the Franklin Mortgage and Investment Company to front for several industrial alcohol companies they took over and operated. In a 3-month period, 350,000 gallons of bootlegged alcohol were transported from the Publicker plant in Little Italy by the Reading Railroad in large oil drums marked tar or asphaltum to one of the alcohol companies under the syndicate's control. After the alcohol was processed, it was placed in bottles and labeled as hair oil or perfume. Hoff's association with the Union Bank and Trust Company gave him the ability to finance the bootleg syndicate via a $10 million money laundering plan. Normal banking procedures were bypassed, allowing him to open 14 accounts using the names of dead people or just fake names. The bank's president was forced to resign after it was determined that he had served as the fake owner of several blocks of Atlantic City real estate worth millions of dollars, which were bought by Hoff and his associates. To ensure the delivery of booze to brothels, bars, and restaurants, members of the Philadelphia Police Department were paid off by bootleggers and speakeasy owners. It was estimated that the bribes paid to cops by bar owners totaled $2 million a year. Of the 87 officers questioned, many of them were fired or resigned because they couldn't explain such increases in their bank accounts and real estate and stock holdings. The owner of Military Sales Company, Edward S. Goldberg, admitted that he sold submachine guns and bulletproof vests to Hoff. During one raid, about 450 machine guns were discovered in the store basement in Philadelphia. In 1929, The New York City Police Department complained that most of their confiscated guns were bought in Philadelphia. The $500,000 worth of European liquor and champagne seized in a raid on a barge near Mount Holly, New Jersey, was traced back to Hoff's gang. After Prohibition was repealed in 1933, Hoff's luck began to run out. The IRS sued Hoff for $21,000 in unpaid income taxes, in which his home in Cobbs Creek Park was sold by the sheriff for $1,200 and his car was sold for $240. Hoff was arrested in Philadelphia's 30th Street station for allegedly attempting to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. Bad luck forced Hoff to sell his last entertainment venture, an ice cream shop called the Village Barn, near the University of Pennsylvania campus. Hoff's body was found on April 27, 1941, by his second wife, Margaret. The autopsy showed the cause of death as a heart ailment. Michael "Mickey" Duffy, also known as John Murphy and George McEwen, was a Polish-American mobster and rival of Max Hoff during Prohibition. He became one of the most famous and powerful beer bootleggers in Philadelphia and Atlantic City. Born William Michael Cusick to Polish immigrants in Grays Ferry, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he changed his name to fit in well with the Irish gangs in Philadelphia. Duffy became involved in petty theft and other misdemeanors during his youth, before more serious crimes during his teenage years, including armed robbery and hijacking prior to entering bootlegging during Prohibition. In May 1919, Duffy was arrested for assault and battery with intent to kill, serving 2 years and 11 months at the Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia. Upon his release, Prohibition was law and organized crime syndicates began smuggling, making and selling illegal alcohol. By the early 1920s, Duffy had become one of the most dominant bootleggers in the Delaware Valley, possessing breweries in Philadelphia, Camden, and South Jersey. His associates included former rivals Max Hassel, Harry Green, James Richardson, Charles Bodine, and Nicholas Delmore, although he would be in frequent battles against rivals such as Hoff and the Bailey brothers throughout the decade. During this time, Duffy expanded into legitimate businesses, including owning several prominent clubs, including the Perkin and the fashionable Club Cadix at 23rd and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia in 1924. He ran his bootlegging and numbers businesses from the old Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Duffy was shot 3 times, leaving the Club Cadix late on the night of February 25, 1927, by Francis Bailey and Peter Ford. His bodyguard, John Bricker, was killed on scene, and Earl Brown, the club's doorman, was also wounded. This shooting was the first instance of a Thompson submachine gun being used in Philadelphia's underworld. Duffy was treated at Hahnemann Hospital in Philadelphia and returned to his bootlegging business. In the mid-1920s, Duffy's violent methods brought him into conflict with Reading-based bootlegger Max Hassel. Along with Waxy Gordon, Hassel controlled a number of breweries in Pennsylvania and northern New Jersey. The aggressive Duffy forced his way into the lucrative Jersey territory, forcing Hassel to hand over a brewery to him. Duffy earned such great profits from both beer and numbers businesses that by 1930 he had built a mansion for himself and his wife Edith in Penn Wynne, Pennsylvania. Duffy's home was on the Penn Wynne side of City Line across from 77th Street. Built by McWilliams and Maloney in the style of a Mediterranean villa, the structure had white with green satyrs on the sides and black palm trees painted on the facade. Following the death of John Finiello, an agent of the Bureau of Prohibition killed during a September 19, 1930 raid on one of Duffy's breweries in Elizabeth, New Jersey, local authorities began cracking down on his criminal operations, causing some animosity among his partners, including his bodyguard and chauffeur, Joseph Beatty. While staying at the Ambassador Hotel in Atlantic City, Duffy was shot to death by unknown assailants on August 31, 1931. Although the case remained unsolved, It was suspected by authorities at the time that the alleged assailants may have been associates who had been disgruntled with Mickey and had conspired to seize control of his bootlegging operations. Initially, Mafia member and future boxing promoter Frankie Carbo of the Lucchese crime family was charged with Duffy's murder, but was not prosecuted after furnishing an alibi due to a lack of evidence. Within several months, two individuals alleged to have been involved, Samuel E. Grossman and Albert Scale, were gunned down at a club on Watt Street and Girard Avenue in December 1931, beginning a wave of violence among various factions among the Philadelphia underworld. Frankie Carbo was born in Agrigento, Sicily, on August 10, 1904. He was sent to the New York State Reformatory for juvenile delinquents at age 11. Over the next 10 years, he would be in and out of prison on charges including assault and grand larceny. During this period, Frankie was arrested for the murder of a taxi driver who refused to pay protection money. Pleading not guilty, Frankie Carbo claimed self-defense. He eventually agreed to a plea bargain of manslaughter in exchange for a reduced sentence of 2 to 4 years in prison. After serving 20 months in prison, Carbo was released. With the passage of Prohibition, he began working as a hired gunman for several bootlegger gangs. In 1931, Carbo was charged with the murder of Philadelphia mobster Michael "Mickey" Duffy in Atlantic City, New Jersey. However, he was eventually released. During the early 1930s, he began working for Murder Inc. under boss Louis Lepke Buchalter. By the end of the 1930s, he had been arrested 17 times and had been charged with 5 more murders. In 1939, he allegedly participated in the murder of informant Harry "Big Greenie" Greenberg in California. He was arrested for it 2 years later. This time, former Murder Inc. members Abe "Kid" Twist Rillies and Ali "Tick-Tock" Tannenbaum agreed to testify against Frankie Carbo. However, before the trial began, Kid Twist, who was under police protection, fell to his death from a window of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. His death was ruled a suicide, and the case against Carbo was eventually dismissed. Former Philadelphia crime family boss Ralph Natal has claimed that Frankie was responsible for murdering Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel in Beverly Hills, California, in 1947 at the behest of Meyer Lansky. During the 1940s, he became a boxing promoter, working along with Ettore Eddie Coco, James "Jimmy" Doyle Plumeri, Frank "Blinky" Palermo, Harry "Champ" Siegel, and Felix Bocciccio. The group was known as the Combination. Together, they were highly successful in fixing high-profile boxing matches. Carbo eventually became known as the Czar of Boxing. In a 2002 interview with The Observer, Bud Schulberg talked about Carbo and his partner Palermo and their involvement in a 1954 welterweight championship fight. Frankie Carbo, the mob's unofficial commissioner for boxing, controlled a lot of the welters and middles. Not every fight was fixed, of course, but from time to time, Carbo and his lieutenants, like Blinky Palermo in Philadelphia, would put the fix in. When the Kid Gavilan Johnny Saxton fight was won by Saxton on a decision in Philadelphia in 1954, I was covering it for Sports Illustrated and wrote a piece at that time saying boxing was a dirty business and must be cleaned up now. It was an open secret. All the press knew that one and other fights were fixed. Gavilan was a mob-controlled fighter too, and when he fought Billy Graham, it was clear Graham had been robbed of the title. The decision would be bought. If it was close, the judges would shade it the way they had been told. Saxton was managed by Blinky Palermo. After losing his title to Tony DeMarco in 1955, he would regain it in a 1955 title match against welterweight champ Carmen Basilio, another fight considered to be fixed. By 1959, Carbo and his partner Blinky Palermo owned a majority interest in the contract of heavyweight boxer Sonny Liston, who went on to win the World Heavyweight Championship in 1962. From the start of his pro career in 1953, Liston had been owned by St. Louis mobster John Vitale, who continued to own a stake in the boxer. At the time Palermo and Carbo acquired their interest in Liston, the notorious Carbo was imprisoned on Rikers Island, having been convicted of the undercover management of prize fighters and unlicensed matchmaking. According to both FBI and newspaper reports, Vitale and other mobsters reportedly controlled Liston's contract, with Vitale owning approximately 12%. Liston fought 12 fights under the control of Carbo and Palermo. In the late 1950s, Carbo started running into legal troubles. First, he was convicted of managing boxers without a license and was sentenced to 2 years in the New York City jail on Rikers Island. Following his release in 1960, Carbo was subpoenaed to appear before a Senate investigating committee to testify on his involvement in professional boxing. Carbo took the Fifth Amendment 25 times, answering, "I cannot be compelled to be a witness against myself." Former world welterweight and middleweight champion Carmen Basilio testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly during its investigation of professional boxing, giving evidence on Carbo, Carbo's partner Frank Palermo, a member of the St. Louis crime family, and Carbo's aide, Gabriel Genovese, a cousin of Mafia Don Vito Genovese, who was convicted in 1959 of being an unlicensed boxing manager. Calling for a house cleaning of professional boxing, Basilio's testimony revealed that his former managers had to pay off organized crime for his title shots, and that he essentially had a behind-the-scenes manager in Genovese. Evidence submitted to the subcommittee showed that Basilio's on-the-record managers, John DeJohn and Joseph Netro, paid Gabriel Genovese over $39,000 and approximately $25,000 respectively during the time Basilio fought for and defended his welterweight and middleweight titles. Genovese was a frontman for Carbo. In 1961, Carbo and boxing promoter Frank Palermo were charged with conspiracy and extortion against the National Boxing Association welterweight champion Don Jordan. After a 3-month trial in which U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy served as prosecutor, Carbo was sentenced to 25 years in prison, serving his sentence at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in California, McNeil Island in Washington State, and United States Penitentiary, Marion in Illinois. Granted early parole due to ill health, Carbo was released from prison. He died in Miami Beach, Florida, on November 9, 1976. A member of the Jewish mob, Meyer Lansky developed a gambling empire that stretched around the world. He was said to own points percentages in casinos in Las Vegas, Cuba, Miami, and New Orleans. He had a strong influence with the Italian-American Mafia. He played a large role in the consolidation of the criminal underworld by introducing money laundering and offshore banking in 1932, used in the 1950s for cash from the heroin trade. The full extent of this role has been the subject of some debate, as Lansky himself denied many of the accusations against him. Despite nearly 50 years as a member participant in organized crime, he was never found guilty of anything more serious than illegal gambling. He has a legacy of being one of the most financially successful gangsters in American history. Luciano had a vision to form a national crime syndicate in which the Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs could pool their resources and turn organized crime into a lucrative business for all, an organization he founded after a conference in Atlantic City organized by himself, Lansky, Johnny Torrio, and Frank Costello in May 1929. Also, as early as 1932, Lansky shifted money from illegal activities in New Orleans to Swiss offshore accounts. The Swiss secrecy law from 1934 sanctioned the money laundering by banks whose officials knew very well they were working for criminals. By 1936, Lansky had established gambling operations in Florida and Cuba. These gambling operations were successful, as they were founded upon two innovations. First, Lansky and his connections had the technical expertise to manage them effectively, based upon Lansky's knowledge of the mathematical odds of most popular wagering games. Second, mob connections, as well as bribed law enforcement, were used to ensure legal and physical security of their establishments from other crime figures and law enforcement. There was also an absolute rule of integrity concerning the games and wagers made within their establishments. Lansky's carpet joints in Florida and elsewhere were never clip joints, where gamblers were unsure of whether or not the games were rigged against them. Lansky ensured that the staff administering the games were men of high integrity. During World War II, Lansky was also instrumental in helping the Office of Naval Intelligence Operation Underworld, in which the government recruited criminals to watch out for German infiltrators and submarine-borne saboteurs. Lansky helped arrange a deal with the government via a high-ranking United States Navy official. This deal secured the release of Luciano from prison. In exchange, the Mafia would provide security for the warships that were being built along the docks in New York Harbor. German submarines were sinking Allied ships in great numbers along the eastern seaboard and the Caribbean coast, and there was great fear of attack or sabotage by Nazi sympathizers. Lansky connected the naval intelligence operation with Luciano, who reportedly instructed Joseph Lanza to prevent sabotage on the New York waterfront. In 1946, Lansky convinced the Italian-American Mafia to place Siegel in charge of Las Vegas and became a major investor in Siegel's Flamingo Hotel. To protect himself from the type of prosecution which sent Al Capone to prison for tax evasion and prostitution, Lansky transferred the illegal earnings from his growing casino empire to a Swiss bank account, where anonymity was assured by the 1934 Swiss Banking Act. Lansky eventually bought an offshore bank in Switzerland, which he used to launder money through a network of shell and holding companies. In 1946, Lansky attended a secret meeting in Havana to discuss Siegel's management of the Flamingo Hotel, which was running far behind schedule and costing Siegel's Mafia investors a great deal of money. While the other bosses wanted to kill Siegel, Lansky begged them to give his friend a second chance. Despite this reprieve, Siegel continued to lose money on the Flamingo. A second meeting was then called. By the time this meeting occurred, the casino had turned a small profit. Lansky, with Luciano's support, convinced the other investors to give Siegel more time. When the hotel started losing money again, the other investors decided that Siegel was finished. It is widely believed that Lansky himself was compelled to give the final okay on eliminating Bugsy Siegel due to his long relationship with him and his stature in the organization. On June 20, 1947, Siegel was shot and killed in Beverly Hills, California. 20 minutes after the Siegel hit, Lansky's associates, including Gus Greenbaum and Mo Sedway, walked into the Flamingo and took control of the hotel. According to the FBI, Lansky retained a substantial financial interest in the Flamingo for the next 20 years. Meyer said in several interviews later in his life that if it had been up to him, Ben Siegel would be alive today. Siegel's death marked a power transfer in Vegas from New York's five families to the Chicago outfit. Although his role was considerably more restrained than in previous years, Lansky is believed to have both advised and aided Chicago boss Tony Accardo in initially establishing his hold in the Las Vegas underworld. After World War II, as a reward for his wartime service, Luciano's pandering sentence was commuted to time served. Lucky's release was conditioned on his agreeing not to contest the revocation of his American citizenship and accept deportation to his native Italy. After arriving in Italy, he settled in Sicily. He secretly moved to Cuba, where he worked to resume control over Mafia operations. He also ran a number of casinos in Cuba with the sanction of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Upon discovering his presence in Cuba and resumption of criminal activity, the U.S. government pressured the Batista regime into deporting him to Italy. Batista and Lansky formed a renowned friendship and business relationship that lasted for a decade. During a stay at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York in the late 1940s, it was mutually agreed upon that, in exchange for kickbacks, Batista would offer Lansky and the Mafia control of the country's casinos and racetracks. Batista would open Havana to large-scale gambling, and his government would match, dollar for dollar, any hotel investment over $1 million, which would include a casino license. Lansky would place himself at the center of Cuba's gambling operations. He immediately called on his associates to hold a summit in Havana. The Havana Conference was held on December 22, 1946, at the Hotel Nacional. This was the first full-scale meeting of American underworld leaders since the Chicago meeting in 1932. Present were such figures as Joe Adonis, Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia, Frank Costello, Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, Vito Genovese, Mo Dalit, Santo Traficante Jr. from Tampa, Carlos Marcello from the New Orleans crime family, and Stefano Magaddino, Bonanno's cousin from Buffalo. From Chicago there were Accardo and the Fischetti brothers, Trigger-Happy Charlie and Rocco Fischetti, and representing the Jewish interest, Lansky, Dalitz, and dandy Phil Castile from Florida. The first to arrive was Luciano, who secretly traveled to Havana with a false passport. Lansky shared with the attendees his vision of a new Havana, profitable for those willing to invest the right sum of money. According to Luciano, the only attendee who ever recounted the events in any detail, he was appointed as kingpin for the mob, to rule from Cuba until such time as he could find a legitimate way back into the U.S. Entertainment at the conference was provided by, among others, Frank Sinatra, who had flown to Cuba with his friends, the Fischetti brothers. In 1952, Lansky offered then-president of Cuba Carlos Prios Socaris a bribe of $250,000 to step down so Batista could return to power. Once Batista retook control of the government in a military coup in March 1952, he quickly put gambling back on track. Batista offered Lansky an annual salary of $25,000 to serve as an unofficial gambling minister. By 1955, he had changed the gambling laws once again, granting a gaming license to anyone who invested $1 million in a hotel or $200,000 in a new nightclub. Unlike the procedure for acquiring gaming licenses in Vegas, this provision exempted venture capitalists from background checks. As long as they made the required investment, they were provided with public matching funds for construction, a 10-year tax exemption, and duty-free importation of equipment and furnishings. The government would get $250,000 for the license, plus a percentage of the profits from each casino. Cuba's 10,000 slot machines, even the ones that dispense small prizes for children at country fairs, were to be the province of Batista's brother-in-law, Roberto Fernandez y Miranda, brother of his wife Marta Fernandez Miranda de Batista. A Cuban army general and government sports director, Fernandez was also given the parking meters in Havana as an extra bonus. Import duties were waived on materials for hotel construction, and Cuban contractors with the right in made windfalls by importing much more than was needed and selling the surplus to others for hefty profits. It was rumored that besides the $250,000 to get a license, sometimes more was required under the table. Periodic payoffs were requested and received by corrupt politicians. Lansky set about reforming the Cabaret Montmartre, which soon became the in place in Havana. Lansky also installed a casino into the Hotel Nacional, relying on the support of Batista. By the 1950s, Lansky used his money laundering system for income from heroin trade. The 1959 Cuban Revolution and the rise of Fidel Castro changed the climate for mob investment in Cuba. On New Year's Eve 1958, while Batista was preparing to flee to the Dominican Republic, initially before settling permanently in Francois, Spain, where he died in exile in 1973, Lansky was celebrating the $3 million he made in the first year of operations at his 440-room, $8 million palace, the Habana Riviera. Many of the casinos, including several of Meyer's, were looted and destroyed that night. Lansky had fled January 7th to the Bahamas, in Nassau, where the Bay Street Boys were ruling. On January 8, 1959, Castro and his revolutionaries took control of Havana, setting up a command post in the Hilton. The new Cuban president, Manuel Urrutia Yeo, took steps to close the casinos. In October 1960, Castro nationalized all the island's hotel casinos and outlawed gambling. After the revolution, Lansky sought compensation for losses in Cuba from the United States government. Meyer Lansky is credited with having controlled compromising pictures of a sexual nature featuring former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover with his longtime aide Clyde Tolson. In his book, Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover, biographer Anthony Summers cites multiple primary sources regarding Lansky's use of blackmail to gain influence with politicians, policemen, and judges. One stage for the acquisition of blackmail materials was orgies held by late attorney and Hoover protege Roy Cohn and liquor magnate Louis Rosenstiel, who had lasting ties with the Mafia from his bootleg operations during Prohibition. The 2019 release of FBI files on Lansky revealed extensive monitoring and investigation, which makes it harder to explain why he was not pursued to conviction, unless he successfully evaded it by blackmail. Cohn copied this model of blackmail to control politicians and evade conviction himself. In 1970, Lansky fled to Herzliya Petua, Israel, to escape federal tax evasion charges in the United States. He was a strong sympathizer with Israel. At the time, Israeli law did not permit the extradition of Israeli citizens, and under the law of return, any Jew could legally settle in the state of Israel and naturalize. The Israeli government reserved discretion to exclude Jews with a criminal past from permanently settling in the country. 2 years after his arrival, Lansky was deported back to the United States. The federal government brought Lansky to trial with the testimony of loan shark Vincent Fat Vinny Teresa. Lansky was acquitted in 1973.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Frank Costello was born Francesco Castiglia on January 26, 1891, in Loropoli, a frazione of the town of Cassano allo Ionio in the province of Cosenza in the Calabria region, Italy. In 1895, he boarded a ship to the United States with his mother and his brother Edward to join their father, who had moved to New York City's East Harlem several years earlier and opened a small neighborhood Italian grocery store. Along with Italian-American associates Vito Genovese and Tommy Three Finger Brown, and Jewish associates Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the gang became involved in robbery, theft, extortion, gambling, and narcotics. The Luciano Costello-Lansky-Siegel alliance prospered even further with the passage of Prohibition in 1920. The gang went into bootlegging, backed by criminal financier Arnold "the Brain" Rothstein. While Frank was still a boy, his brother introduced him to gang activities. At 13, he had become a member of a local gang and started using the name Frankie. He committed petty crimes and went to jail for assault and robbery in 1908, 1912, and 1917. In 1918, he married Loretta Geigerman, a Jewish woman who was the sister of a close friend. That same year, Costello served 10 months in jail for carrying a concealed weapon. While working for the Morello gang, Costello met Charlie "Lucky" Luciano, the Sicilian leader of Manhattan's Lower East Side gang. The two Italians immediately became friends and partners. Several older members of Luciano's mob family disapproved of this growing partnership. They were mostly old-school mafiosi who were unwilling to work with anyone who was not Italian, and skeptical at best about working with non-Sicilians. To Luciano's shock, they warned him against working with Costello, whom they called the Dirty Calabrian. The young Italians' success let them make business deals with the leading Jewish and Irish criminals of the era, including Dutch Schultz, Oni the Killer Madden, and William Big Bill Dwyer. Rothstein became a mentor to Costello, Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel while they conducted bootlegging business with Bronx beer baron Schultz. In 1922, Costello, Luciano, and their closest Italian associates joined the Sicilian crime family led by Joe the Boss Masseria, a top Italian underworld crime boss. By 1924, Costello had become a close associate of Hell's Kitchen's Irish crime bosses Dwyer and Madden. He became involved in their rum-running operations, known as the Combine. This might have prompted him to change his last name to the Irish Costello. In 1926, Dwyer was convicted of bribing a Coast Guard official and sentenced to 2 years in jail. After Dwyer was imprisoned, Costello and Madden took over the Combine's operations. This caused friction between Madden and a top Dwyer lieutenant, Charles Vanny Higgins, who believed he should have been running the Combine instead of Costello. Thus, the Manhattan Beer Wars began between Higgins on one side and Costello, Madden, and Schultz on the other. At this time, Schultz was also having problems with gangsters Jack Legs Diamond and Vincent Mad Dog Call, who had begun to rival Schultz and his partners with Higgins' help. Eventually, the Costello-Madden-Schultz alliance was destroyed by New York's underworld. In the late 1920s, Johnny Torrio helped to organize a loose cartel of East Coast bootleggers, the Big Seven, in which a number of prominent gangsters, including Costello, Luciano, Longy Zwillman, Joe Adonis, and Meyer Lansky, played a part. Torrio also supported the creation of a national body that would prevent the sort of all-out turf wars between gangs that had broken out in Chicago and New York. His idea was well received, and a conference was hosted in Atlantic City by Torrio, Lansky, Luciano, and Costello in May 1929. The National Crime Syndicate was created. In early 1931, the Castellamarese War broke out between Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. In a secret deal with Maranzano, Luciano agreed to engineer the death of his boss, Masseria, in return for receiving Masseria's rackets and becoming Maranzano's second-in-command. On April 15, 1931, Luciano had lured Masseria to a meeting where he was murdered at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro on Coney Island. While they played cards, Luciano allegedly excused himself to the bathroom, with the gunmen reportedly being Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Ciro, the Artichoke King Terranova, drove the getaway car, but legend has it that he was too shaken up to drive away and had to be shoved out of the driver's seat by Siegel. Luciano took over Masseria's family, with Genovese as his underboss. In September 1931, Luciano and Genovese planned the murder of Maranzano. Luciano had received word that Maranzano was planning to kill him and Genovese, and prepared a hit team to kill Maranzano first. When Maranzano summoned Luciano, Genovese, and Costello to a meeting at his office, they knew Maranzano would kill them there. Instead, Luciano sent to Maranzano's office 4 Jewish gangsters whose faces were unknown to Maranzano's people. They had been secured with the aid of Lansky and Siegel. After assassinating Maranzano, Luciano subsequently created the Commission to serve as the governing body for organized crime. In 1931, after the Masseria and Maranzano murders, Luciano became the leader of his own crime family bearing his name, with Genovese as underboss and Frank Costello as consigliere. Costello quickly became one of the biggest earners for the Luciano family and began to carve his own niche in the underworld. He controlled the slot machine and bookmaking operations for the family with associate Philip Dandy Phil Castell. Costello placed approximately 25,000 slot machines in bars, restaurants, cafes, drugstores, gas stations, and bus stops throughout New York. In 1934, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia confiscated thousands of Costello's slot machines, loaded them on a barge, and dumped them into the river. Frank's next move was to accept Louisiana Governor Huey Long's proposal to put slot machines throughout Louisiana for 10% of the take. Costello made Castell overseer of the Louisiana slot operation. Castell had the assistance of New Orleans mafioso Carlos Littleman Marcello. Frank brought in millions of dollars in profit from slot machines and bookmaking to the Luciano family. Costello and Luciano established extensive connections with Tammany Hall leaders early on. Luciano and Costello each shared hotel rooms with Tammany delegates to the 1932 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Costello continued to cultivate those relationships over the next 2 decades, intervening in Tammany's affairs and collecting favors and pledges of loyalty from those politicians and judges he had helped, including William O'Dwyer, the 2-term mayor of New York City in the 1940s. Costello was able, in turn, to use those political debts to his advantage when other New York City crime families came to him for help. The 1951 Kefauver Committee hearings on organized crime confirmed what observers of local politics already knew. Senator Kefauver concluded that Carmine DeSapio, leader of Tammany Hall, was assisting Costello and that Costello had become influential in decisions made by the Tammany Hall Council. DeSapio admitted to having met Costello several times, but insisted that politics was never discussed. When Lucky was convicted of running a prostitution ring and was sentenced to a term of up to 30 to 50 years in state prison, he attempted to run the crime family from prison with the help of Costello and Lansky, but found it too difficult. With Luciano's imprisonment, Genovese became acting boss of the Luciano crime family. From May 1950 to May 1951, the U.S. Senate conducted a large-scale investigation of organized crime, commonly known as the Kefauver hearings, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Costello attempted to minimize the impact of these hearings on his reputation when he was called as a witness, refusing to allow his face to be filmed during his questioning. His demands had the opposite effect, as the news cameras focused instead on his hands as Costello fidgeted throughout the hearings, broadcasting his evasive answers and nervous gestures live to a huge nationwide audience. After sparring with the lawyers for the committee for hours on the first day, he walked out of the hearing on the second day, claiming that he had a sore throat. When he returned to be questioned several days later, he refused to answer questions about his net worth. Costello was eventually convicted of contempt of the Senate and sentenced to 18 months in prison for his refusal to answer questions. The Kefauver hearings also led to the murder of Willie Moretti on October 4, 1951, on the orders of the Mafia Commission. The members of the commission were concerned with Moretti's erratic behavior before the Senate committee and worried that Moretti's advancing syphilis was affecting his brain and might lead him to talk to the press. Costello appointed Genovese as the new underboss after Moretti's murder. In 1937, Genovese fled to Italy to avoid prosecution for a 1934 murder. Luciano then appointed Costello as acting boss. Costello's underboss was his cousin Willie Moretti. In 1952, the government began proceedings to strip Costello of his U.S. citizenship, and he was indicted for evasion of $73,000 in income taxes between 1946 and 1949. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $20,000. However, Costello appealed the conviction about 2 years later and was released on $50,000 bail. From 1952 to 1961, he was in and out of half a dozen federal and local prisons and jails, his confinement interrupted by periods when he was out on bail, pending determination of appeals. Genovese returned to the United States in 1945. After the 1934 murder charges were dismissed following the death of 2 witnesses, Genovese tried to convince Luciano to become a titular boss of bosses and let Genovese run everything. Luciano not only rejected Genovese's proposal, but kept Costello and Moretti as acting boss and underboss. Joe Adonis, a powerful Costello ally, chose deportation to Italy over a long prison sentence. His departure left Costello weakened, but Genovese still had to neutralize one more powerful Costello ally, Anastasia, who had taken over the Mangano crime family after the disappearance of boss Vincent Mangano and the murder of his brother Philip Mangano on April 14, 1951. In early 1957, Genovese decided to move on Costello. Genovese ordered Vincent Gigante to murder Costello, and on May 2, 1957, Gigante shot and wounded Costello outside his apartment building. The altercation persuaded Costello to relinquish power to Genovese and retire. Genovese then controlled what is now called the Genovese crime family. A few months later, Albert Anastasia was murdered at the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel at 56th Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan. Carlo Gambino was expected to be proclaimed boss of the family at the November 14, 1957 Appalachian meeting that Vito Genovese called to discuss the future of Cosa Nostra in light of his takeover. When police raided the meeting, to the detriment of Vito's reputation, Carlo Gambino's appointment was postponed to a later meeting in New York City. In 1959, Vito was convicted of selling a large quantity of heroin. He was sentenced to 15 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, for that incident. During his retirement, Costello was still known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. He still retained power and influence in New York's Mafia and remained busy throughout his final years. Mob bosses and old associates still paid visits to Frank at his Waldorf Astoria penthouse, seeking advice on important Mafia affairs. Costello's old friend Meyer Lansky also kept in touch. Costello occupied himself with gardening and displayed some of his flowers at local horticultural shows. On February 20, 1961, the United States Supreme Court upheld a lower court order that stripped Costello of his U.S. citizenship. But on February 17, 1964, the same court set aside a deportation order for Costello, citing a legal technicality. In early February 1973, Costello suffered a heart attack at his Manhattan home and was rushed to the hospital in Manhattan, where he died on February 18th. Costello's sedate memorial service at a Manhattan funeral home was attended by 50 relatives, friends, and law enforcement agents. Costello is interred in a private mausoleum in St. Michael's Cemetery in East Elmhurst, Queens.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
The politics of the Consolidated City from 1898 to 1945 revolved around conflicts between the political machines and the reformers. In quiet times, the machines had the advantage of the core of solid supporters and usually exercised control of city and borough affairs. They also played a major role in the state legislature in Albany. Tammany, for example, from the 1880s onward, built a strong network of local clubs that attracted ambitious, middle-class ethnics. In times of crisis, however, especially in the severe depressions of the 1890s and the 1930s, the reformers took control of key offices, notably the mayor's office. The reformers were never unified. They operated through a complex network of independent civic reform groups. Each focused its lobbying efforts on its own particular reform agenda. The membership included civic-minded, well-educated middle-class men and women, usually with expert skills in a profession or business, who deeply distrusted the corruption of the machines. The consolidation of Brooklyn, Western Queens County, and Staten Island with Manhattan and the Bronx in 1898 multiplied the power of these reform groups, so long as they could agree on a common agenda, such as consolidation itself. There was no citywide machine. Instead, democratic machines flourished in each of the boroughs, with Tammany Hall in Manhattan the most prominent. They typically had strong local organizations, known as political clubs, as well as one prominent leader often called the boss. Charles Murphy was the highly effective but quiet boss of Tammany Hall from 1902 until his death in 1924. Big Time Sullivan was the Tammany leader in the Bowery and the machine's spokesman in the state legislature. Republican local organizations were much weaker, but they played key roles in forming reform coalitions. Most of the time they looked to Albany and Washington for their sphere of influence. Seth Low, the president of Columbia University, was elected the reform mayor in 1901. He lacked the common touch and lost much of his working-class support when he listened to dry Protestants eager to crack down on the liquor business. Murphy wanted to clean up Tammany's image and sponsored progressive-era reforms benefiting the working class through his two protégés, Governor Al Smith and Robert F. Wagner. Ed Flynn, a protégé of Murphy who became the boss in the Bronx, said Murphy always advised that politicians should have nothing to do with gambling or prostitution and should steer clear of involvement with the police department or the school system. A new challenge to Tammany came from William Randolph Hearst, a powerful newspaper publisher who wanted to be president. Hearst was elected to Congress with Tammany support, was defeated for mayor after a bitter contest with Tammany, and won Tammany support for his unsuccessful quest for the governorship of New York. Hearst did manage to dominate Tammany Mayor John F. Hylan, 1917-25, but he lost control when Smith and Wagner denied Hylan renomination in 1925. Hearst then moved back to his native of California. After Charles Francis Murphy's death in 1924, Tammany's influence on Democratic politics began its wane. Murphy's successor as the boss in 1924 was George W. Olney, the first Tammany Hall boss to have received a college education. When Tammany's Jimmy Walker became the city mayor over Highland in 1925, the hall was poised for advantage. Olney was not an overbearing boss, and the familiar Tammany Hall schemes from a pre-Murphy era began. Police received protection money from shopkeepers, rackets surrounded the fish and poultry markets, as well as the docks, and licensing fees for various professions were increased, with Tammany Hall middlemen reaping the benefits. This bright period of influence for Tammany Hall was short-lived. The population of Manhattan, Tammany's stronghold, no longer represented the population of the city as other boroughs such as Brooklyn and the Bronx made gains. Franklin D. Roosevelt's election as New York State Governor in 1928 further reduced Tammany Hall's power. Although Al Smith guided Roosevelt to the governorship, Roosevelt did not request Smith's advice once there, and instead appointed Bronx boss Edward J. Flynn as New York's Secretary of State. The stock market crash of 1929 and the increasing press attention on organized crime during the Prohibition era also contributed to the Hall's decline. Olney resigned as the boss in 1929, and John F. Curry was tapped to fill the role. Curry beat Eddie Ahern for the role, Al Smith's choice, and often considered to be an abler man. Although he looked the part, Curry was not considered smart enough to fill the role, and proceeded to make a series of poor decisions on behalf of Tammany. The organized crime robbery of a city judge and leader of the Tepecano Democratic Club, Albert H. Vitale, during a dinner party on December 7, 1929, and the subsequent recovery of the stolen goods from gangsters following a few calls from Magistrate Vitale prompted the public to request a closer look at the ties of organized crime, law enforcement, and the judicial system within the city. Vitale was accused of owing $19,600 to Arnold Rothstein and was investigated by the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court for failing to explain how he accrued $165,000 over 4 years, while receiving a total judicial salary of $48,000 during that same period. Vitale was removed from the bench. A further investigation by U.S. District Attorney Charles H. Tuttle discovered that Brooklyn Judge Bernard Voss was paid $190,000 in return for obtaining pier leases for a shipping company, and that another city judge, George Ewald, had paid Tammany Hall $10,000 for the replacement seat of Judge Vitale. FDR responded by launching 3 investigations between 1930 and 1932, headed by Samuel Seabury, called the Seabury Commission. Another Tammany Hall associate, State Supreme Court Justice Joseph Force Crater, disappeared in August 1930 after the start of the first investigation in what would become an unsolved case. Crater was president of a Tammany Hall club. During questioning, Tammany associate and New York County Sheriff Thomas M. Farley denied that gambling took place in his political clubs and could not account for the frequent presence of associates of Arnold Rothstein. Other questioning focused on the combined police, court, and bail bonding scheme surrounding the improper arrest of prostitutes and innocent women. The outcome of these investigations included the dismissal of several corrupt judges, including the city's first female judge, Jean H. Norris, the resignation of Mayor Jimmy Walker, the indictment of Deputy City Clerk James J. McCormick, and the arrest of State Senator John A. Hastings. Sheriff Thomas M. Farley was removed from office by Governor Roosevelt. In 1932, the machine suffered a dual setback when Mayor Jimmy Walker was forced from office by scandal and reform-minded Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. Tammany Hall leader John F. Curry and Brooklyn political boss John H. McCooey had joined forces to support Al Smith's candidacy. Roosevelt and his lead campaign manager, James Farley, stripped Tammany of federal patronage, which had expanded under the New Deal, and passed it instead to Ed Flynn, boss of the Bronx, who had kept his district clean of corruption. Roosevelt also helped Republican Fiorello LaGuardia become mayor on a fusion ticket in 1933, thus removing even more patronage from Tammany's control. After becoming mayor, LaGuardia reorganized the city cabinet with nonpartisan officials and sought to develop a clean and honest city government. Tammany Alderman Alfred J. Williams died in December 1933. When the Board of Aldermen reconvened in January 1934, it defied party leadership and elected an ally of LaGuardia as his successor. The shock from this decision caused Tammany Bronx leader Augustus Pierce to collapse and die of a heart attack in the aldermanic chambers. As mayor, LaGuardia successfully led the effort to have a new city charter adopted, which would mandate a proportional representation method of electing members of the city council. The measure won on a referendum in 1936. After the new charter went into effect in 1938, the ward system, which had allowed only a small number of people to serve on the city council since 1686, ceased to exist, and the new 26-member New York City Council now had certain functions governed by the Board of Estimate. LaGuardia's appointees filled the Board of Magistrates and virtually every other long-term appointive office, and the power of Tammany Hall had now been reduced to a shadow of what it once was. LaGuardia also greatly increased the number of city jobs awarded by the civil service system. Roughly 3/4 of city positions required job seekers to take an exam in 1939, compared to only about half in 1933. In 1937, LaGuardia defeated Jeremiah T. Mahoney to become the first anti-Tammany reform mayor to ever be re-elected in the city's history, and was again re-elected in 1941 before retiring in 1945. His extended tenure weakened Tammany in a way that previous reform mayors had not. Tammany depended for its power on government contracts, jobs, patronage, corruption, and ultimately the ability of its leaders to control nominations to the Democratic ticket and swing the popular vote. The last element weakened after 1940 with the decline of relief programs such as the WPA and CCC that Tammany used to gain and hold supporters. Congressman Christopher Christie Sullivan was one of the last bosses of Tammany Hall before its collapse. Tammany had close ties to street gangs throughout the 19th century, who provided services to Tammany on Election Day in return for legal protection the rest of the year. Those relations largely collapsed with the rise of newer crime organizations that flourished during Prohibition. Tammany came to depend on figures such as Arnold Rothstein to maintain some measure of control, however limited, over them. Rothstein's murder in 1928 weakened Tammany. It also contributed to the election of Fiorello LaGuardia in 1933 and the appointment of Thomas E. Dewey as special prosecutor, appointed by Governor Herbert H. Lehman in 1935. Dewey obtained the conviction of powerful mobster and strong Tammany ally Lucky Luciano on racketeering charges in 1936. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years. While Luciano was still able to maintain control of the powerful Luciano crime family from prison until his sentence was commuted to deportation to Italy in 1946, his conviction gave Dewey the prestige required to continue prosecution of organized crime figures and their political allies, particularly in Tammany Hall. In 1939, Dewey, now Manhattan District Attorney, prosecuted longtime Tammany Hall boss Jimmy Hines on bribery charges. Hines was convicted and sentenced to 4 to 8 years. The loss of Hines would serve as a major blow to Tammany, as he had given the political machine strong ties to the city's powerful organized crime figures since the 1920s. Several Tammany Hall officials affiliated with Hines and Luciano were also successfully prosecuted by Dewey. In 1943, Manhattan District Attorney Frank Hogan provided a transcript of a recorded phone message between Frank Costello and Judge Thomas A. Aurelio, a Tammany associate running for the state Supreme Court, the trial-level court within New York's judicial system, on both the Republican and Democratic tickets, in which Aurelio pledged his undying loyalty to Costello. When Costello was called as a witness in Aurelio's disbarment proceedings, he freely admitted that he had used his influence to make Michael Kennedy the new head of Tammany and to secure Aurelio's nomination. While Aurelio avoided disbarment and even won re-election to his position on the bench, Kennedy resigned his position within Tammany in January 1944. Costello and Tammany went on to help elect former Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer to the mayorship in 1945. O'Dwyer was re-elected in 1949, then resigned the following year due to a bribery scandal that implicated both O'Dwyer and Costello, and that led to the resignations of hundreds of police officers accused of protecting gambling operations, and the replacement of all 336 members of the New York City Police Department's Plainclothes Division. Although the Kefauver hearings, an investigation into organized crime, did not directly impact Tammany, it did not help its image regarding its apparent connection to organized crime. O'Dwyer, now ambassador to Mexico, returned in 1951 to testify about the bribery scandal and sought to deflect any accusations of wrongdoing, but was unable to offer any persuasive explanation for his visit to Costello's apartment in 1941, when he first sought Tammany's support in his campaign for mayor. O'Dwyer resigned as ambassador the following year, following the conviction of one of his close associates for accepting bribes. Tammany never recovered from prosecutions of the 1940s, but staged a small-scale comeback in the early 1950s under the leadership of Carmine DeSapio, who succeeded in engineering the elections of Robert F. Wagner, Jr., an outspoken liberal Democrat, as mayor in 1953, and W. Averell Harriman as governor in 1954, while simultaneously blocking his enemies, especially Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Jr., in the 1954 race for state attorney general. Unlike previous Tammany bosses, however, DeSapio had promoted himself as a reformer and always made his decisions known to the public. The fact that DeSapio was of Italian descent also demonstrated that Tammany was no longer dominated by Irish-American politicians. Under DeSapio's leadership, the ethnicity of Tammany Hall's leaders diversified. However, DeSapio's close ties with the city's lead mobster Frank Costello, Luciano's self-appointed successor, helped establish him as a corrupt figure. During DeSapio's reign, Costello was the main person who influenced the decisions made by Tammany Hall officials. By 1956, Costello, who was convicted of tax evasion in 1954 and now controlled the Luciano family from prison, was engaged in a major power struggle with fellow associate Vito Genovese, and his grip on power greatly weakened. In 1957, Costello was released from prison after winning an appeal, but officially abandoned his role as head of the Luciano family following a failed assassination attempt. In 1958, DeSapio's reform image was severely damaged after he ran his own candidate for the Senate, Frank Hogan. New Yorkers now saw DeSapio as an old-time Tammany Hall boss, and Hogan would lose the Senate election to Republican Kenneth Keating. Republican Nelson Rockefeller would also be elected governor the same year. Democrats who once praised DeSapio now excoriated him. In 1961, Wagner won re-election by running a reformist campaign that denounced his former patron, DeSapio, as an undemocratic practitioner of Tammany machine politics. After World War II, a group of young World War II veterans and other reform-minded Democrats began the Lexington Democratic Club in response to being denied access to Tammany Hall politics by the old guard. Eleanor Roosevelt organized a counterattack with Herbert H. Lehman and Thomas Finletter to form the New York Committee for Democratic Voters, a group dedicated to fighting Tammany. In 1961, the group helped remove DeSapio from power. The once mighty Tammany political machine, now deprived of its leadership, quickly faded from political importance, and by 1967 it ceased to exist. Its demise as the controlling group of the New York Democratic Party was sealed when the Village Independent Democrats under Ed Koch wrested away control of the Manhattan Party. In its very early days, the Tammany Society met in the back rooms of various taverns, most often in Barden's Tavern on Broadway near Bowling Green. These back rooms served as unofficial campaign headquarters on election days. In 1791, the Society opened a museum designed to collect artifacts relating to the events and history of the United States. Originally presented in an upper room of City Hall, it moved to the Merchants Exchange when that proved to be too small. The museum was unsuccessful, and the Society severed its connections with it in 1795. In 1798, the Society moved to more permanent and spacious quarters, the Long Room of Brom Martling's Tavern at Nassau Street and Spruce Street, near where City Hall is today. Tammany controlled the space, which it dubbed the Wigwam, and let other responsible political organizations it approved of use the room for meetings. This space became commonly known as Tammany Hall. Their new headquarters had limitations as well as advantages, and in 1812 Tammany moved again, this time to a new 5-story $55,000 building it built at the corner of Nassau and Frankfort Streets, just a few blocks away. The new Tammany Hall had a large room that could accommodate up to 2,000 people for political and social events, and the rest of the building was run as a hotel. The Society was to remain there for 55 years. By the 1860s, Tammany under Tweed had much greater influence and affluence, so new headquarters was deemed desirable. The cornerstone for the new Tammany headquarters was laid on July 14, 1867, at 141 East 14th Street, between 3rd Avenue and 4th Avenue. The building at Nassau and Frankfort was sold to Charles Dana and his friends, who bought a newspaper, The Sun, and moved it there. When the leaders of the Society found that they had not raised enough funds and needed $25,000 more, a meeting was held at which $175,000 was immediately pledged. The new wigwam was completed in 1868. It was not just a political clubhouse. Tammany Hall merged politics and entertainment, already stylistically similar, in its new headquarters. The Tammany Society kept only one room for itself, renting the rest to entertainment impresarios, Don Bryant's Minstrels, a German theater company, classical concerts, and opera. The basement, in the French mode, offered the Café aux Antes, where one could see tableaux vivants, gymnastic exhibitions, pantomimes, and Punch and Judy shows. There was also a bar, a bazaar, a ladies' cafe, and an oyster saloon. All this, with the exception of Bryant's, was open from 7 till midnight for a combination price of 50 cents. The building had an auditorium big enough to hold public meetings, and a smaller one that became Tony Pastor's Music Hall, where vaudeville had its beginnings. The structure was topped off by a larger-than-life statue of St. Tammany. In 1927, the building on 14th Street was sold to make way for the new tower being added to the consolidated Edison building. The Society's new building at 44 Union Square, a few blocks north at the corner with East 17th Street, was finished and occupied by 1929. When Tammany started to lose its political influence and its all-important access to graft, it could no longer afford to maintain the 17th Street building, and in 1943 it was bought by a local affiliate of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Tammany left, and its leaders moved to the National Democratic Club on Madison Avenue at East 37th Street, and the Society's collection of memorabilia went into a warehouse in the Bronx. The building at 44 Union Square housed the New York Film Academy and the Union Square Theater, and retail stores at street level, until a complete renovation of the building began in 2016. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated it in October 2013. The renovation, which included a gutting of the interior and the installation of a glass-domed roof, was substantially completed by July 2020. Hoffa had been a Teamsters Union official for many years, with his home base in Detroit. During those years, rumors of his ties with organized crime abounded. Despite that reputation, he was elected president in 1957. As president of the Teamsters, he was an aggressive leader who'd run afoul of the law only after he had run the union for a decade. He wasted little time establishing the Mafia imprimatur on the Teamsters. "Everybody has his price" was the credo by which Jimmy Hoffa managed the union. That policy resulted in payoffs for some and promises of political support or special favors for others. He kept no bank accounts, drew no checks, and when he traveled he carried an attach case that contained up to $500,000 in cash. "Don't forget the case," Hoffa admonished his aides when entrusting the bag to them on his speech-making outings or at contract negotiations. But his greatest impact over the years that he ran the union was on Capitol Hill. Each month of every one of the 10 years he steered the Teamster steamroller through the nation's upper and lower houses, some of Hoffa's most trusted intimates would enter the offices of the representatives and senators who were on the union's friendship rolls and plunk down a large manila envelope on each of those lawmakers' desk. "Here's your copy of the magazine," Hoffa's emissaries said. Indeed, that month's issue of International Teamster was in the envelope, but so were $500 to $1,000 in cash. The practice received a severe setback in the late 1950s after televised United States Senate hearings on illegal Teamster activities. The legislators were so shaken by the disclosures of bribes to government officials and others that many balked at taking any more of Hoffa's money, at least not in their Washington offices in full view of their staffs. As the Teamsters' influence with Congress decreased, one Hoffa stooge told of having walked into an office that had been on his monthly rounds for years and placing the envelope on the representative's desk. "What's this?" demanded the congressman, his face a scowl. "It's this month's International Teamster magazine," the emissary said with a knowing wink. "Out!" the congressman roared. "I want nothing whatsoever to do with the Teamsters. Get out of here!" When Hoffa heard about the snub, he shook his head in disgust. "Why didn't you leave it anyway?" he reprimanded the emissary. The bastard would have taken it just as he always has. While congressmen and senators were becoming increasingly reluctant to remain on his payroll, Jimmy Hoffa exhibited no unease about ripping off his own membership for millions of dollars every month. Jimmy Hoffa had a fertile, creative mind that led him to devise a scheme that came to be known as the money machine. Hoffa put this machine together by rounding up 450,000 Teamster members in 22 states who were asked to cough up from $4 to $20 a month, depending on the contributor's average monthly salary. They let Jimmy assess those fees on his promise that when they grew old and gray, they would retire on a nice fat pension. But Hoffa didn't find any fun in raking in all that money and letting it sit in escrow in some bank account, yielding a puny 4% interest until it came time to distribute it to the retirees. He worked up a scheme by which he'd first keep people who paid into the fund from collecting their pensions, and second, invest in enterprises that yielded the highest possible returns. Trouble was, they'd have to be illegal ventures to bring the kind of rich profits Hoffa anticipated. The money machine was labeled the Central States, Southeast, and Southwest Areas Pension Fund. In its basic operation, it was legal, but it quickly lost all semblance of legitimacy when the machine was thrown into high gear. The gimmick the inventive Hoffa came up with rested on two basic rules. Contributors to the fund had to abide by. No one collects a pension if more than 3 years have passed without having made a contribution toward retirement, and each of the 450,000 members must keep records proving the required monthly contribution had been made. How the fund actually worked is to this day one of the great mysteries of Jimmy Hoffa's rule over the Teamsters. Perhaps the most detailed information about the way the fund functioned came from successful federal prosecutions in New York City that were launched when the present New York County District Attorney Robert Morgenthau was the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. An undercover agent, Herbert Itkin, provided details about 10% kickbacks made to middlemen on a number of large loans. Itkin discovered that David Wenger, the fund's accountant, received half the dirty money, then split his cut with Hoffa. The other half of the kickbacks went to the foundation on which the Teamsters was built, the Mafia. The principal recipients of these New York payoffs included labor racketeer Johnny Dio DeAguardi's brother and underworld big, Salvador Granello. Who were the beneficiaries of those loans? The money went to finance gambling casinos run by organized crime figures in Nevada and to gangland investors in various resort enterprises in California and Florida. The money machine also churned out big-buck loans for various businesses that employed Teamsters. One firm was the Bally Manufacturing Company, makers of pinball machines. This was a sweetheart of a deal for at least two of the company's stockholders, Frank Fitzsimmons and William Presser. Fitzsimmons just happened to be Jimmy Hoffa's chief underling in the union, and Presser was a power in the Ohio Teamsters as well as a pension fund trustee. Later investigations turned up evidence that the fund had invested heavily in high-risk enterprises such as motels and bowling alleys and in speculative real estate deals. Many of these ventures failed, and the fund was the loser on these investments. Yet Hoffa and those who nursed the fund continued to rake in the money. The time was rapidly approaching for Hoffa to take a fall. His reckless ways with the money machine were going to help bring about his arrest, conviction, and imprisonment for pension fraud, bribery, and jury tampering. Hoffa's most brazen act in managing the fund was the arrangement that allegedly enabled Alan Dorfman, son of an Al Capone associate, to be the conduit for hundreds of dollars in pension reserves that wound up in so many of those shaky real estate ventures operated by gangsters and stock swindlers. Dorfman remained in that role. His official title was the Central States Insurance Agent, until Hoffa was sent off to serve his time in the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Then Dorfman took over as the head of the pension fund, yet on the largest decisions he had to await word from Hoffa at the prison. This arrangement fell through after Frank Fitzsimmons was shunted into the $200,000 a year Teamsters presidency by Hoffa, who wanted his close ally to be the union's caretaker while he was in jail. But Fitzsimmons rejected Hoffa's guidance the first week Jimmy was in jail. Hoffa's lawyers went to him to change his ways, but he turned them away. "Don't bother me. I don't want to hear it," he told them. Shortly afterward, Dorfman followed Fitz's lead and refused to consult with Hoffa on pension fund matters. Hoffa vowed that a day would come when he'd be released from prison, return to the helm of the Teamsters Union, and again manage those hundreds of millions of dollars in trust that flowed into high-risk ventures controlled by the Mafia. It all began in 1962 when a federal grand jury in Nashville, Tennessee, indicted the Teamster president for violating federal labor laws. A mistrial was declared after reports of jury tampering. Over the next 2 years, an investigation overseen by Attorney General Robert Kennedy sought to ferret out what happened at that trial. The probers made profit, and Hoffa was indicted anew, found guilty, and sentenced to 8 years in prison for jury fixing, with an additional 5 years for fraud and conspiracy in the handling of the union's benefit fund. However, Hoffa's appeals were not exhausted until 1967, and only then did he surrender and begin serving his time at Lewisburg Penitentiary. By the time he had done half of his sentence, Hoffa used a ploy on President Richard M. Nixon, who always had been an ally of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Hoffa agreed to say that he was retiring as Teamsters president and renouncing any and all ambitions to regain a seat in the union organization's ruling councils. Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence and made him a free man. The terms of the release of America's most corrupt labor leader had a string attached to it. Hoffa must not meddle in Teamster Union activity before March 1980, when his 13-year sentence would expire. But Jimmy wasted precious little time trying to unseat Fitzsimmons, whom Nixon had once described as "my kind of labor leader." While still in the midst of his efforts to regain the presidency, Hoffa left his home in the Detroit suburb of Marion on a sweltering August day in 1971, and has not been seen since. Ex-Teamsters warhorse Dave Beck, who handpicked Jimmy Hoffa as his successor for the union's presidency in 1957, said in 1978, "The mob murdered him, but I don't know who." There has been a persistent rumor in the years since Hoffa vanished that his probable assassin was New Jersey crime czar and labor racketeer Anthony "Tony Pro" Provenzano. But Hoffa's murder was never officially tied to him, though Tony Pro was indicted, prosecuted, and incarcerated for other killings. Perhaps Hoffa was slain and his corpse ditched on a roadside that has since become a paved rest area for those many thousands of truck drivers he robbed in his years at the helm of the Teamsters. Frank Fitzsimmons' leadership of the Teamsters lasted until 1981, when he died of cancer. He was succeeded by Roy L. Williams, the union's vice president, who was elected despite a federal indictment that hung over him for union abuses and widespread reports that he was linked to organized crime. Williams finally was convicted in 1982 when found guilty of conspiring to bribe a United States senator and defrauding the union's Central States Pension Fund. He was sent to prison. Jackie Presser, son of William Presser, one-time head of the Joint Council in the Cleveland area, who had been dispatched to prison to do 3 separate stretches, was elected the union's president. 3 years after Jackie Presser was made head of the Teamsters, a federal grand jury came along and indicted him for embezzlement and racketeering in a union local. Once again, things didn't look too well for the Teamsters hierarchy, but there were worse scandals that kept encircling them. What I mean is, you could get $1 million and you could get it in cash. I know where it could be gotten. We could get the money. There is no problem in that. Those words were spoken by Richard Nixon on March 21, 1973, in a conversation with White House counsel John Dean while discussing the Watergate burglars' demands for huge sums of hush money. But when the transcript of that tape-recorded conversation was disclosed a year later, some reporters speculated on what the president was really thinking. And it remained one of the myriad mysteries that were never cleared up in the wake of the Watergate investigation. When that scandal broke, the first ugly, indeed horrific words that flashed before some people in the Justice Department was that there'd been a huge mob payoff. One of the first thoughts that occurred to a member of the Justice Department's probers was that Nixon, in his tape-recorded conversation, was talking about a secret cash fund that had been raised by racketeers hooked up with the Teamsters. According to a Time magazine article of August 1977, the Department of Justice believed, and a later FBI inquiry substantiated, that the purpose behind the largesse may well have been that the $1 million the president spoke about was intended as a payoff for the administration's cooperation in preventing Jimmy Hoffa from wresting the Union presidency from Nixon's favorite labor leader, Frank Fitzsimmons, a staunch Nixon supporter. But why should Nixon have sprung Hoffa and then, according to the FBI findings, exerted every effort in his power to knock him down? An article appearing in the New York Times on November 11, 1977, discloses that Hoffa felt that Nixon was pressured by his buddy, Frank Fitzsimmons, to commute Hoffa's sentence. Fitzsimmons was unhappy over the power Hoffa was wielding over the Teamsters from behind prison walls and could see the handwriting on the wall. Within a year or two, Hoffa would be paroled after doing minimum time. Then he'd be out on the street and wooing the Teamster rank and file, as well as many of its officers, to put him back in the presidency. Fitzsimmons decided to end the suspense. He wanted Hoffa's comeback to happen as soon as possible, thus his appeal to Nixon to give Hoffa his walking papers. The sooner the better. Nixon is said to have signed the documents hurriedly. Moreover, when Fitzsimmons approached Nixon for a deal, he came with a handful of requests besides Hoffa's commutation. Fitzsimmons also told the president that electronic surveillance of Chicago Mafia chieftain Anthony Accardo and other mob figures had to cease at once. They didn't want the Justice Department monitoring their conversations about the Teamsters' membership pension funds. According to information the authors were privileged to see in FBI reports, two leading union figures, Tony Provenzano and his muscle man Sal Bergoglio, were the likely culprits in the payoff plans. It all began when mafioso chieftain Accardo met the union's top honcho, Fitzsimmons, in early January of 1973 at a plush spa resort hotel in California, which Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Retirement Fund partially financed a few years previously. Tony told Fitz that he was well aware of his friendship with Nixon and laid it on the line to him. Three of Nixon's aides, John Ehrlichman, H.R. Haldeman, and John Dean, were at the hotel that very day. Nixon was staying that weekend at his retreat in San Clemente. Close enough, in fact, to be able to give Frank Fitzsimmons a lift on Air Force One when the presidential plane took off from California for Washington that late Sunday afternoon. On the flight, we're told, Fitzsimmons said to Nixon, "Mr. President, I know you've been in touch with the gentlemen I met earlier today at my hotel, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Dean. I don't believe they told you what we're prepared to pay for the request I put on the table." Fitzsimmons then went on, "You'll never have to worry about where the next dollar will come from in any future campaign you're involved in, nor after you leave the White House." Nixon is said to have turned to Fitzsimmons and stared him down for the last word on what reward the labor leader would offer for the favors the Mafia was asking of him. The response allegedly was, "We're going to give you $1 million up front, Mr. President, and then there'll be more that'll follow to make certain you are never left wanting." Within 30 days, every demand Fitzsimmons had put before Nixon's three top aides was granted. All probes into the Mafia and Teamsters were scuttled, the wiretaps on Accardo and other mobsters were rescinded, and arrangements were made to spring Hoffa. Meanwhile, according to government informers, Provenzano and Bergoglio were engaged by the mob to handle plans for the payoffs. The first installment came due in early January 1973. It was a $500,000 cash payment that the FBI believes was handed to Charles Colson, who handled the administration's dealings with the Teamsters, or his emissary, in Las Vegas on January 6, 1973. The timing was crucial. For just a few months before, Watergate burglar Howard Hunt, who had become a loose cannon in the administration, was pressuring his lawyer, William Bittman, for the money he'd been promised for his continued silence. Bittman had a meeting with Colson on January 3rd. Later, Colson told Dean, "Bittman came at me like a train. There is striking evidence that such a payoff occurred." The FBI found hotel records showing one of Provenzano's couriers was in Las Vegas on January 6, 1973. Then, too, there's Colson's White House calendar that Watergate probers obtained in 1974. For reasons not clear either then or today, Colson had blank pages for the weekend of January 6th and 7th, a phenomenon that didn't occur on any other weekend in all his years at the White House. The calendar provided a significant clue that the FBI believes filled the gap on what happened that untelling weekend. Colson spoke with Fitzsimmons on Monday, January 8th. What did they discuss? Colson was later asked by the FBI. "Gee, I just can't remember what I talked about with Fitz," he replied. "And I certainly know nothing about any Teamster payoff." The FBI first went after Dean, then Ehrlichman and Haldeman, who were in prison after the Watergate scandals. Finally, the G-men targeted former Attorney General John Mitchell, also in jail by then for his role in the Watergate cover-up. How can you ask me if I dropped the investigations into the Teamsters Union and those other organized crime cases because the president was bribed to do that? Mitchell asked in high dudgeon. The inquiries were aborted because we finally decided none of the cases had merit, that there simply wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. According to a Time magazine article, the FBI had planned to question Nixon about the purported payoffs, but never went through with it. The mystery has lain on the Justice Department's back burner for more than 10 years. And now Rudolph W. Giuliani is about to give it a second, and without a doubt, far more comprehensive investigation from behind the desk he occupies in the United States District Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Giuliani is bringing the Teamsters' top leadership, some 23 people, to court and trying to strip them in a civil suit of their positions in the union. At the same time, he will ask a federal judge to appoint a trustee to supervise the union's affairs until such time as the rank and file can vote for new officers who are free of the taint of corruption and influence of organized crime. Giuliani would not say on what grounds beyond a civil action he will prosecute the Teamster bigwigs. But if he delves into the union's criminal activities, then it's quite likely that more will surface about the Nixon administration's relations with the corrupt and crooked leaders who misguided the Teamsters through the years. When John F. Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential election, he won by just 113,000 votes. A massive 68 million votes had been cast, so Kennedy had scraped home by a margin of less than 0.2 of a percentage point. Key to his victory was Cook County, formerly the playground of Al Capone. It delivered an overwhelming 450,000 votes to Kennedy, giving him 27 electoral votes from the state of Illinois and the presidency. His father, Joe Kennedy, had been a bootlegger in the Prohibition era, so he had good connections with the Mafia. He used all his influence on behalf of his son. In particular, he recruited Chicago's mayor, Richard Daley, the last of the big city bosses. Daley was re-elected every 4 years from 1955 to 1975. John F. Kennedy would joke that on the eve of the election, his father had asked him the exact number of votes he would need to win, because there was no way he was paying for a landslide. Kennedy had Mafia links of his own. In February 1960, he was at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas when Frank Sinatra introduced him to a young woman named Judith Campbell. They became lovers. A week after their first assignation, she met Sam Giancana, who was head of the Chicago outfit from 1957 to 1966. Because of Giancana's shoot first, ask questions later policy, there were 75 gangland murders in Chicago during his 9-year reign. He was also said to have several police chiefs on the payroll, and he claimed to have Cook County locked up tight. One day, Kennedy told Campbell that he may need Giancana's help with his campaign. She acted as a liaison between the two men, and a meeting was set up in a Miami Beach hotel that April. Kennedy was so pleased with the outcome that he promised to divorce his wife Jackie and marry Campbell if he failed to win the Democratic nomination. Later, Giancana promised to deliver the river wards to Kennedy in the November election. According to Campbell, Giancana boasted that he had got her boyfriend elected, though Mayor Daley also claimed credit. A few days after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, Campbell said that Kennedy called her and asked her to fly to Las Vegas. He needed her to pick up an envelope from Johnny Roselli, underboss in the Los Angeles crime family. The envelope was delivered to Giancana, and another meeting between Kennedy and the mob boss was set up at the Ambassador East Hotel in Chicago. After Fidel Castro had taken over in Cuba in 1959, he had closed down the Mafia's lucrative gambling operations there, so the mob had every reason to throw their weight behind Operation Mongoose, a series of assassination attempts on Fidel Castro. Relations between John F. Kennedy, Judith Campbell, and Sam Giancana cooled after Kennedy's brother Robert, the United States Attorney General, began investigating the Mafia. The story of John F. Kennedy's Mafia connections died with his assassination in 1963, but they resurfaced in 1975. Just 5 days after Giancana had been gunned down in his home, Johnny Roselli was called in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee that was investigating the plot to kill Castro. Roselli revealed nothing to the committee, but the mob bosses considered him a security risk, so he was kidnapped, shot, and strangled. After that, his legs were sawn off, and his body was stuffed into a 55-gallon oil drum, which was weighted with chains and dumped in the sea in Florida. However, gases from his decomposing corpse caused the drum to float to the surface. His killers were never identified, though it is thought that Florida mob boss Santo Trafficante, another of the Operation Mongoose conspirators, had ordered the hit. There were also rumors that Roselli had been involved in the assassination of Kennedy, who had failed to honor promises made to the Mafia during his election. Robert F. Kennedy was chief counsel to the Senate Labor Rackets Committee under John L. McClellan when he famously squared up to Jimmy Hoffa, president of the Teamsters Union. Hoffa's predecessor, Dave Beck, cited the Fifth Amendment over 100 times during his appearance before the McClellan Committee in 1957. The Fifth Amendment protects witnesses from being forced to incriminate themselves. Nevertheless, in 1959, he was prosecuted for embezzlement, labor racketeering, and tax evasion, and was jailed for 3 years. After Hoffa took over in 1957, the Teamsters were expelled from the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, whose leader, George Meany, said that he could only agree to the return of the Teamsters if Hoffa was dismissed as their president. Among other things, there were allegations that Hoffa had diverted $500,000 into Nixon's campaign fund. In 1960, Robert Kennedy published The Enemy Within, an account of union malpractices. After running his brother's campaign, John made Robert Attorney General. In that role, he began a successful campaign against organized crime. Convictions rose 800% during his term of office. He continued his pursuit of the Teamsters and confronted Hoffa again in televised hearings. Then in 1962, he tried to prosecute Hoffa for taking kickbacks from a trucking company, but the trial ended with a hung jury. In 1964, one of Hoffa's union associates, Edward Parton, turned surprise federal witness, and Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering. He was sentenced to 8 years in jail. Later that year, he was also convicted of fraud in respect of the improper use of the Teamsters pension fund, and a further 5 years was added to his sentence. However, he was released in December of 1971 after serving less than 5 years of his 13-year prison term. President Nixon had commuted his sentence to time served. The Teamsters then gave him a $1.7 million lump sum pension, something they had never done before. On July 30, 1975, Hoffa had an appointment with 2 Mafia leaders, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone from Detroit and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, a member of the Genovese crime family in New York. Provenzano was also Hoffa's former vice president in the Teamsters. They were to meet in the parking lot of the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Oakland County, Michigan. Hoffa was never seen again. Giacalone and Provenzano denied meeting him, but few doubt that Hoffa's disappearance was the work of the mob. According to former Teamster official Daniel Sullivan, Hoffa told him sometime before that, "Tony Pro threatened to pull my guts out or kidnap my grandchildren if I continued to attempt to return to the presidency of the Teamsters." Richard Kuklinski, a Polish hitman allegedly working for the Mafia, claims to have killed Hoffa. So does Donald "Tony the Greek" Frankos, another freelance hitman for the Mafia. According to Frankos, he and some other Mafia killers picked Hoffa up at the Red Fox and took him to a house in Mount Clemens, Michigan. "I pumped 2 slugs into Hoffa's forehead," said Frankos. "Then they cut his body up with a chainsaw. The remains were bagged up to be disposed of in a mob-run garbage disposal facility." However, the manager was worried about handling such a high-profile case, so the parts were left in the freezer until they were finally buried in the foundations of the Giant Stadium in New Jersey. Hoffa's body was never found, so in accordance with the law, he was declared legally dead 7 years after his disappearance.